They called him cautious, timid, a general who moved like he was walking through a minefield even when the path was clear. Dwight Eisenhower questioned his nerve. George Patton openly mocked him at dinner parties, calling him slow and unimaginative. The British barely hid their frustration. His name was General Harry Krar, and he commanded the 1st Canadian Army. Nobody thought he had what it took to win a war. But in August 1944, Omar Bradley would hand him 560,000 troops and the fate of the entire European campaign. What happened next would silence every critic and change the course of World War II forever. The story begins not in the killing fields of France, but in the quiet contempt of Allied headquarters. Spring 1944. The invasion of Europe was being planned down to the smallest detail. Eisenhower commanded the largest military operation in human history. Under him were legends. George Patton, the fire-breathing cavalryman who thought war was mankind's greatest adventure. Bernard Montgomery, the meticulous British general who'd beaten Rommel in Africa. Omar Bradley, the soldier's general, quiet and deadly effective. And then there was Harry Krar. Krar was everything the others weren't. No charisma. No flair for dramatic speeches. No appetite for publicity. He was a staff officer who'd risen through competence rather than glory. A military administrator who understood logistics, supply lines, and the grinding arithmetic of modern war. To men like Patton he was everything wrong with modern military leadership. Too cautious. Too concerned with casualties. Too unwilling to take the bold risks that won wars and made legends. The mockery started early. Patton would hold court at officers' dinners, whiskey in hand, regaling audiences with stories of aggressive maneuver warfare. Then he'd pause, grin, and make some cutting remark about generals who moved at the speed of a funeral procession. Everyone knew who he met. Krar would be at the same dinners sometimes, his face impassive, saying nothing. The British officers would exchange knowing glances. The Americans would smirk. Only Omar Bradley seemed to withhold judgment. Eisenhower's doubts were more professional but just as damaging. In private communications, he questioned whether Krar had the aggressive spirit needed for the coming campaign. The Canadian First Army would be a crucial component of the invasion force, but Ike worried that Krar would bog down, would fail to exploit opportunities, would let the enemy escape when bold action could destroy them. These weren't casual concerns. Eisenhower was betting everything on a successful invasion. He couldn't afford weak links in his command structure. Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces for the initial invasion, had his own reservations. Monty was many things: arrogant, difficult, politically astute, but he was also a professional who recognized competence when he saw it. He'd worked with Krar before and knew the Canadian was methodical and reliable. But reliable wasn't exciting. It didn't win headlines or inspire troops. And Montgomery needed commanders who could execute his grand vision with speed and aggression. He wasn't sure Krar fit that mold. What none of them understood was that Harry Krar had spent his entire career being underestimated. Born in Hamilton, Ontario in 1888, he'd grown up in a Canada still finding its identity within the British Empire. He'd attended the Royal Military College of Canada, then served with distinction in World War I. He'd seen the slaughterhouse of trench warfare, watched entire battalions disappear in minutes of futile attacks, learned that aggressive spirit without intelligent planning was just organized suicide. Between the wars, Krar became a student of military science. He studied the new theories of mechanized warfare. He understood that the next war wouldn't be won by brave men charging machine guns, but by coordinated combined arms operations where infantry, armor, artillery, and air power worked together like instruments in an orchestra. He knew that logistics won wars. That supply lines mattered more than bravery. That dead soldiers couldn't take objectives, no matter how heroically they died. But knowledge and understanding don't translate to respect in a military culture that worships aggressive action. When Krar took command of the 1st Canadian Army in 1944, he inherited a force that was eager to prove itself but largely untested in major combat operations. The Canadians had fought with distinction at Dieppe, where they'd been slaughtered in a disastrous raid that proved exactly what Krar believed, that aggression without proper planning was murder, not war. They'd fought in Sicily and Italy with growing competence. But they hadn't yet faced the full weight of the German military machine in a decisive engagement. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion succeeded beyond hopes. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Allied forces poured into Normandy. But the celebration was premature. Nazi Germany was far from finished. The Wehrmacht was the most professional, experienced, and tactically sophisticated army on the planet. They'd been fighting for 5 years. They knew every trick, every technique, every method of defensive warfare. And they were about to turn Normandy into hell on earth. The bocage country of Normandy was a defender's paradise. Ancient hedgerows, thick as fortress walls, divided the countryside into a maze of small fields. Every hedgerow could hide an anti-tank gun. Every farmhouse could be a strongpoint. Every sunken road could be a killing zone. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, used the terrain brilliantly. They turned every Allied advantage in numbers and firepower into a grinding war of attrition. The advance slowed to a crawl. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The Allies were stuck. Casualties mounted. Entire divisions were chewed up, taking villages that didn't appear on most maps. Patton raged at the lack of progress. Montgomery insisted his plan was working, that he was drawing German forces onto the British and Canadian sectors so the Americans could break out in the West. Eisenhower grew increasingly frustrated with everyone. And Harry Krar's 1st Canadian Army ground forward, meter by bloody meter, through some of the worst fighting of the campaign. They took Cannes, or what was left of it after Allied bombing reduced the medieval city to rubble. They fought for every street, every building, every pile of debris. The Germans contested every inch. SS Panzer divisions, fanatical and skilled, made the Canadians pay in blood for every advance. Patton watched from the American sector and saw exactly what he expected. Slow progress. Methodical attacks. Nothing brilliant. Nothing daring. Just grinding, predictable, unimaginative warfare. He made sure his opinions were known. In conversations with other generals, in letters to friends back home, in his famous diary, Patton expressed his contempt for commanders who couldn't match his aggressive style. Krar was Exhibit A. What Patton didn't understand, what none of the critics understood, was that Krar was doing exactly what needed to be done. The Canadian and British sectors were facing the bulk of German armored strength. Entire panzer divisions that could have devastated American forces were instead locked in combat with Krar's troops. Every German tank destroyed in front of the Canadians was a tank that couldn't stop Patton's eventual breakout. Every SS soldier killed fighting Canadians was one fewer elite soldier to defend the Reich. Krar knew this. He'd studied the operational plans. He understood his role. The 1st Canadian Army wasn't supposed to race to Paris. They were supposed to hold the German army in place, to fix them in position, to bleed them white while the Americans prepared their breakout operation. It was an unglamorous mission. Nobody would write songs about holding actions. But it was absolutely essential. July turned to August. The Americans finally broke through. Patton's 3rd Army erupted out of the bocage and into open country, racing south and east in the kind of spectacular armored advance that made headlines and won glory. Patton was in his element, driving his forces forward at breakneck speed, cutting behind German lines, creating chaos and confusion. This was the warfare he loved. Fast, aggressive, dramatic. But Patton's spectacular advance created an opportunity that was even more dramatic. As 3rd Army raced east and then turned north, and as the British and Canadians continued to pressure from the north, the entire German position in Normandy began to collapse. 2 entire German armies, the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, suddenly found themselves in a pocket. The Americans were curving around behind them. The British and Canadians were pushing from the north. There was still a gap to the east, near the town of Falaise, but that gap was closing. Omar Bradley saw it first. The quiet general from Missouri who'd been Eisenhower's classmate at West Point, who'd commanded with steady competence throughout the campaign, who never sought glory but always delivered results, Bradley saw the opportunity of the war. If they could close the Falaise gap, if they could seal the pocket completely, they could destroy the German forces in France. Not defeat them. Not push them back. Destroy them. Capture or kill hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Eliminate dozens of divisions. End German organized resistance west of the Seine River. The plan was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. The Americans would form the southern jaw of the trap, pushing north toward Falaise. The British and Canadians would form the northern jaw, pushing south. They'd meet somewhere near Falaise and seal the pocket. Everything inside would be destroyed. It was the kind of decisive victory that could change the entire course of the war. But there was a problem. The northern jaw, the force that had to push south through the most heavily defended terrain, past the strongest German positions, against some of the best troops the Wehrmacht had left, that force would be commanded by Harry Krar. The general everyone doubted. The cautious Canadian who'd never commanded in a decisive battle of this scale. The man Patton mocked and Eisenhower questioned. Bradley made his decision. He would give Krar operational command of not just the 1st Canadian Army, but additional British and Polish forces as well. In total, 560,000 men. The largest force any Canadian commander had ever led in history. More men than Patton currently commanded. More men than Montgomery had in his immediate sector. The entire northern hammer of the most important operation of the European campaign. When word spread through Allied headquarters, the reaction was shock. Eisenhower was stunned. He trusted Bradley's judgment, but this seemed like an enormous risk. Patton was outraged. He actually laughed when he heard the news, a bitter, mocking laugh. The idea that cautious, plotting Harry Krar would command more troops than George Patton in the decisive battle of the campaign was almost insulting. British officers had mixed reactions. Some respected Krar's competence. Others worried that the crucial northern attack would lack the aggressive spirit needed to close the trap before the Germans escaped. Only Bradley remained confident. He'd worked with Krar throughout the campaign. He'd seen the Canadian grind through impossible defensive positions. He'd watched Krar manage complex operations involving multiple nationalities and arms of service. Bradley understood something the others didn't. You don't win decisive battles with flash and daring. You win them with methodical, relentless pressure applied at the right place at the right time. And Harry Krar was exactly the man to deliver that pressure. Krar received his orders without fanfare. 560,000 troops. The northern attack toward Falaise. The fate of the campaign potentially resting on his shoulders. No pressure. Just the weight of history and the knowledge that everyone from Eisenhower down to junior officers was watching, waiting to see if the cautious Canadian would finally be exposed as inadequate for modern mobile warfare. If Krar felt the pressure, he didn't show it. He'd been underestimated before. He'd been mocked before. None of it mattered. What mattered was the mission. Close the gap. Destroy the German forces. Win the battle. Everything else was noise. August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize began. This was Krar's attack toward Falaise. He'd planned it with characteristic thoroughness. It would be a night attack, using darkness to negate German defensive advantages. Heavy bombers would blast corridors through enemy lines. Armored columns would advance in tight formation, using radio beacons and tracer fire to maintain direction in the darkness. Infantry would follow in armored personnel carriers, protecting them from small arms fire during the advance. It was innovative, complex, and risky. Everything the critics claimed Krar couldn't do. The night attack began under a bomber moon, enough light to see but enough darkness to confuse defenders. The ground shook as hundreds of heavy bombers pounded German positions. Then the armor moved forward. The initial advance was spectacular. Canadian and Polish armored divisions punched through the first line of German defenses. They advanced several miles in the darkness, bypassing strong points, rolling over surprised defenders. By dawn, they'd achieved one of the deepest penetrations of German lines since D-Day. It looked like Krar had done it. The cautious general had delivered a decisive breakthrough. But the Germans were not finished. They never were. Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, was one of the most aggressive and skilled German commanders on the Western Front. Young, fanatical, and brilliant in defensive combat, Meyer had spent weeks preparing for exactly this kind of attack. When dawn revealed the extent of the Canadian breakthrough, he launched immediate counterattacks. The fighting that developed was among the most savage of the Normandy campaign. SS Panzer units hit the flanks of the Canadian advance. Tiger tanks, nearly invulnerable from the front, engaged Canadian Shermans in close-range duels. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single day. The advance slowed, then stalled, then became a brutal slugging match where both sides fed in reinforcements and neither would yield. Back at Allied headquarters, the critics found their ammunition. See, they said. Krar had his breakthrough and couldn't exploit it. Too cautious. Too slow. A bolder commander would have pressed forward regardless of casualties. Patton certainly would have. Even the initial success was being reframed as a failure because Krar hadn't reached Falaise in a single bound. But Krar wasn't trying to be spectacular. He was trying to win. Every German division pulled into the fight against him was a division that couldn't escape the pocket. Every Tiger tank destroyed defending against the Canadian advance was a Tiger that couldn't spearhead a German breakout attempt. Meyer's counterattacks were tactically successful, they stopped the Canadian breakthrough, but they were strategically suicidal. Meyer was throwing his best troops into a battle they couldn't win, in a pocket they couldn't escape. Krar adjusted his plan. If a single massive breakthrough wouldn't work, he'd apply relentless, methodical pressure. He'd attack, force the Germans to commit reserves, then attack again. And again. And again. Not spectacular but effective. The kind of warfare that ground down enemy strength and gave them no rest, no opportunity to disengage, no chance to reorganize. August 14th. Operation Tractable began. This was Krar's second major push toward Falaise. He'd learned from Totalize. This attack would be in daylight but behind a massive smoke screen. Bombers would hit German positions again, but more carefully to avoid hitting friendly forces. The advance would be on a narrower front, concentrating force rather than spreading it out. The Canadians and Poles attacked into the smoke and the fire. The Germans knew they were coming and were ready. Every hedgerow had an anti-tank gun. Every farmhouse had been fortified. Every approach was registered for artillery. The defenders were a mix of elite SS troops and regular Wehrmacht soldiers, all fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they were trapped. The village of Potigny became a charnel house. Canadian infantry fought house to house against SS Panzer Grenadiers. Neither side gave quarter. Tank battles erupted in the narrow streets. Artillery from both sides pounded the rubble. When the Canadians finally took Potigny after 36 hours of continuous fighting, they counted over 1,000 German dead in and around the village. Their own casualties were staggering. But they were advancing. Slowly. Bloodily. But advancing. Every kilometer south was another kilometer of the gap closed. Every German strongpoint eliminated was one fewer obstacle between them and Falaise. The mathematics of the battle were working in Krar's favor, even as the human cost mounted. The Polish 1st Armored Division, under Krar's command, pushed toward the town of Trun, further east. The Poles had their own scores to settle with the Germans. Their homeland had been destroyed. Their families were dead or enslaved. They fought with a fury that shocked even veteran German troops. When Polish tanks encountered German positions, the fighting was apocalyptic. Neither side took many prisoners. August 17th. 5 days into Tractable. 9 days into the battle for the Pocket. The Canadians entered Falaise, or what was left of it. The medieval town had been bombed repeatedly. Artillery had reduced most buildings to rubble. Fires still burned from the latest bombardment. The Germans defended every pile of debris, every ruined building, every street. Canadian infantry cleared Falaise in brutal close-quarters fighting. Grenades through windows. Machine gun fire down narrow alleys. Snipers in the rubble. Combat engineers using flamethrowers to clear basements and bunkers. The smell of death and smoke hung over everything. By nightfall, Falaise was in Canadian hands, purchased with hundreds of lives. But taking Falaise wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. The gap between Canadian forces advancing from the north and American and French forces pushing from the south was still open. Narrower now but open. And through that gap, tens of thousands of German troops were desperately trying to escape. The roads east of Falaise became a killing ground beyond description. Allied aircraft controlled the skies and used that control mercilessly. Typhoons and thunderbolts dove repeatedly on the German columns. Rockets streaked into concentrations of vehicles. Machine guns strafed anything that moved. The roads became jammed with burning tanks, shattered artillery pieces, dead horses and bodies beyond counting. On the ground, Allied artillery had the range of every escape route. Fire missions were called in continuously. The German columns were forced to bunch up at bottlenecks, creating perfect targets. Entire battalions disappeared under artillery barrages. The few German units that maintained cohesion tried to fight back, setting up anti-aircraft guns to protect the retreat, but they were overwhelmed. The Poles reached Moissy on August 18th, then pushed toward Chambois. They were exhausted, low on ammunition and facing German forces that outnumbered them. But they held their positions, plugging the escape route. German troops, desperate to break through, launched human wave attacks against Polish positions. The fighting was primordial. Bayonets. Grenades. Men grappling in the dirt. The Poles held. August 19th. The gap was now only a few kilometers wide. American forces were pushing north. Canadian forces were pushing south. Polish forces held the critical road junction at Chambois. The pocket was nearly closed. But nearly wasn't completely. And the Germans were still trying to escape. The village of St. Lambert-sur-Dives became the focal point. It sat astride one of the last escape routes. Canadian forces, now joined by elements of the American 90th Infantry Division, fought to take and hold the village. The Germans threw everything they had at dislodging them. Tanks, artillery, infantry assaults. Nothing worked. The Canadians and Americans held, and every hour they held, more Germans were trapped. The scale of the slaughter was becoming apparent. Allied reconnaissance reported roads choked with destroyed vehicles for miles. Entire German divisions had ceased to exist. Supply columns, medical units, headquarters elements, combat formations, all were mixed together in a desperate mob trying to reach the gap before it closed completely. Krar coordinated the closing of the pocket from his headquarters, managing forces from multiple nations, all exhausted, all running low on supplies, all being pressed to their absolute limits. He positioned artillery to cover escape routes. He directed armor to block roads. He ensured that fighter bombers had constant updates on enemy positions. It was the kind of complex, multinational operation that required extraordinary staff work and careful coordination. The kind of operation that a cautious, methodical general who understood logistics and coordination could excel at. August 21, 1944. The Falaise Pocket was closed. Canadian forces from the north met American and French forces from the south. Polish forces held the eastern edge. The trap was complete. Inside the pocket, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were destroyed as fighting forces. The estimates of German casualties varied, but the consensus was staggering. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 killed. 50,000 captured. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Over 300 tanks. Over 2,000 other vehicles. Hundreds of artillery pieces. Mountains of supplies and ammunition. But numbers don't capture the reality. Eisenhower visited the battlefield a few days later. He'd seen combat in 2 wars. He'd walked battlefields before. But nothing prepared him for the Falaise Pocket. He stood on a road and looked in both directions. As far as he could see, the landscape was covered with destroyed vehicles and dead bodies. The smell was overwhelming. Thousands of dead horses, essential for German logistics, were bloating in the August heat. Wrecked tanks and trucks were everywhere. The ground was cratered from artillery and bombs. Eisenhower later wrote that the scene was one of destruction so complete it was almost impossible to comprehend. He could walk for hundreds of yards on planks laid across destroyed vehicles without touching the ground. In places, the dead were stacked 3 and 4 deep. This was what decisive victory looked like. Not parades and celebrations. Death on an industrial scale. The complete destruction of enemy forces. And it had been delivered by the general everyone had mocked. Harry Krar and his 560,000 troops had closed the northern jaw of the trap and held it closed. They'd absorbed the worst German counterattacks. They'd ground through prepared defensive positions. They'd coordinated air, artillery, armor, and infantry across multiple national forces. They'd done exactly what Omar Bradley had trusted them to do. Patton, racing east toward Paris, said nothing publicly about Krar's success. In his diary he complained that the pocket should have been closed faster, that more Germans should have been captured. But even Patton couldn't deny the strategic reality. The German army in France was destroyed. The road to Paris was open. The road to the German border was open. The war in the West had fundamentally changed because of what happened at Falaise. Montgomery, who'd commanded the overall ground operation, was generous in his praise of the Canadian First Army. He recognized that Krar had performed exactly as needed under extraordinary pressure. The coordination between British, Canadian, Polish, and American forces had been far from perfect. There had been communication problems, disputes over boundaries, arguments over tactics, but it had worked. The mission was accomplished. Eisenhower's assessment was more guarded. He recognized the victory but remained focused on what came next. The war wasn't over. Germany had to be invaded. The Wehrmacht was badly damaged but still dangerous. There would be more battles, more casualties, more difficult decisions. But privately, Ike acknowledged that he'd underestimated Harry Krar. The Canadian had proven himself under the harshest possible test. What the historians would debate for decades was whether the pocket could have been closed faster. Should the Canadians have taken more risks in the initial attacks? Should the Americans have pushed harder from the south? Did timidity on both sides allow thousands of German troops to escape who should have been captured? These questions are still argued today. But they missed the fundamental point. The Falaise Pocket was closed. The German army in France was destroyed. The strategic situation was transformed. And Harry Krar commanded the force that made it possible. Not through brilliant maneuvers or aggressive risks, but through methodical, relentless pressure applied exactly where and when it was needed. The cost was staggering. The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 18,000 casualties in the Normandy campaign. The fighting around Falaise alone cost thousands of lives. Entire units were decimated. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. These weren't the kind of casualties you got from cautious, timid leadership. These were the casualties of sustained combat against a skilled, determined enemy in terrain that favored the defender. Krar understood something about war that his critics never fully grasped. Modern industrial warfare wasn't about individual brilliance or aggressive spirit. It was about systems, logistics, coordination, the ability to mass overwhelming force at the decisive point and sustain that pressure until the enemy broke. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the stuff of adventure novels. But it won wars. After Falaise, the nature of the war changed. The Germans no longer had the strength to mount sustained defensive operations in France. They retreated toward the German border, fighting delaying actions but unable to stop the Allied advance. Paris was liberated on August 25. The Allies reached the German border by September. The end seemed near, though in reality months of hard fighting remained. Krar and the 1st Canadian Army continued to fight through the autumn of 1944 and into 1945. They cleared the Channel ports, essential for Allied logistics. They fought in the Scheldt estuary, opening the port of Antwerp in some of the most miserable conditions of the war. They advanced into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine and pushing toward the final surrender. Through all of this, Krar never became famous. No reporters followed him looking for colorful quotes. No photographers captured him in dramatic poses. He gave few interviews and wrote no memoirs. While Patton became a household name and Montgomery became a British hero and Eisenhower became president, Harry Krar quietly retired and lived out his life in relative obscurity. But the soldiers who served under him never forgot. They knew what he'd done. They knew that when it mattered most, when the entire weight of the campaign rested on his shoulders, when everyone expected him to fail, he delivered exactly what was needed. Not glory. Not headlines. Just victory. The mockery that came before Falaise seems, in retrospect, almost embarrassing. Patton's criticisms revealed more about Patton than about Krar. Patton was a brilliant tactician and an inspiring leader, but he never commanded an operation as complex as the closing of the Falaise Pocket. He never had to coordinate forces from multiple nations. He never had to balance the political realities of coalition warfare with military necessity. When Patton had problems, he could rely on aggressive maneuver and his ability to inspire troops through force of personality. When Krar had problems, he had to solve them through planning, coordination, and methodical application of force. Eisenhower's doubts were more understandable. I carried enormous responsibility and couldn't afford failures at the command level. But his initial assessment of Krar was based more on style than substance. Krar didn't fit the mold of the aggressive, charismatic general that American military culture celebrated. He was quiet, methodical, and careful. These traits looked like weakness until you saw them applied in combat, and then they revealed themselves as disciplined professionalism. The British assessment of Krar was complicated by the same tensions that affected all Anglo-Canadian relations. Britain was fighting for survival. Canada was fighting by choice to support Britain and to establish its own identity as a nation. British officers sometimes saw Canadian commanders as less experienced or less capable, forgetting that Canadian troops had fought with distinction in every major engagement. Krar bore the weight of these attitudes while trying to command effectively in combat. What makes the Falaise story so compelling is the reversal. The underestimated commander given the most important mission. The mock general handed 560,000 troops. The cautious planner forced to execute in the chaos of mobile warfare. And through it all, the mission accomplished. Not perfectly. Not without terrible cost. But accomplished nonetheless. Omar Bradley emerged from the story with perhaps the most credit. He saw what others missed. He trusted Krar when others doubted. He gave the Canadian the forces and the mission that would prove or break him. Bradley understood that different kinds of battles required different kinds of commanders. Patton was perfect for exploitation, for racing through broken enemy lines and creating chaos. But closing the Falaise Pocket required something else. It required a commander who could manage complexity, coordinate multiple forces, and apply sustained pressure without losing cohesion. Bradley recognized that Krar was that commander. The strategic importance of Falaise cannot be overstated. The destruction of German forces in the pocket effectively ended organized German resistance in France. It opened the way for the rapid Allied advance to the German border. It destroyed divisions that could have defended the Rhine or reinforced other fronts. It captured or killed thousands of experienced soldiers that Germany couldn't replace. Some military historians argue that Falaise, more than any other single battle, ensured the Allied victory in the West would come in 1945 rather than dragging into 1946 or beyond. The human cost of that victory was enormous. Beyond the military casualties, the French civilians in the battle area suffered terribly. Towns and villages were destroyed. Families were killed in the crossfire or by stray bombs. The countryside was poisoned by unexploded ordnance, destroyed vehicles, and the bodies of men and animals. It would take years to clean up the battlefield and decades for some areas to fully recover. For the Canadian military, Falaise represented both triumph and trauma. The 1st Canadian Army had proven itself capable of major offensive operations against elite enemy forces. Canadian commanders and troops had fought with skill and courage. But the cost in lives was staggering. Small towns across Canada received telegrams informing families that sons, husbands, and fathers wouldn't be coming home. The victory was real, but so was the grief. Krar himself rarely spoke about Falaise after the war. He gave some interviews and participated in commemorations, but he never wrote the kind of dramatic memoir that other generals produced. Friends said he was haunted by the casualties. He understood that his decisions had sent thousands of men to their deaths. Those decisions were necessary, and the alternative would have been worse. But understanding necessity doesn't eliminate the moral weight. The tactical lessons of Falaise were studied extensively after the war. The importance of air superiority was reaffirmed. The vulnerability of forces caught in a pocket without adequate air defense was demonstrated brutally. The coordination challenges of multinational operations were highlighted. The difficulty of closing a pocket before enemy forces escaped was noted. All of these lessons would influence NATO planning during the Cold War. But perhaps the most important lesson was about leadership itself. Krar proved that there's no single correct style of command. Aggressive, charismatic leadership like Patton's has its place. Methodical, careful leadership like Krar's has its place too. The key is matching the style to the situation. Patton was brilliant at exploitation. Krar was brilliant at coordination and sustained pressure. The Allies won because they had both kinds of leaders and used them appropriately. The relationship between the Allied commanders was always complex. Eisenhower had to manage enormous egos and competing national interests while trying to win a war. Montgomery was brilliant but difficult, always pushing for more resources and more authority. Patton was effective but undisciplined, prone to saying exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time. Bradley was steady but sometimes indecisive. And Krar was competent but overlooked, fighting for recognition while trying to do his job. These tensions never disappeared. Even after Falaise, there were disputes about credit and blame. Montgomery tried to claim much of the credit for the Canadian success. Patton complained that he should have been allowed to close the pocket from the south. Eisenhower worried about the German troops that had escaped and whether different tactics could have trapped them. Only Krar seemed focused purely on what came next rather than relitigating what had happened. The German perspective on Falaise was of total disaster. Commanders who survived the battle reported that it was worse than anything they'd experienced on the Eastern Front. The combination of Allied air superiority, artillery firepower, and coordinated ground attacks was overwhelming. The attempts to hold the pocket open and allow troops to escape were brave but futile. By the time the pocket was closed, German forces in France had effectively ceased to exist as organized units. Some German generals blamed Hitler for the disaster. The Führer had insisted on holding positions that should have been evacuated earlier. He'd refused to authorize retreats when retreat was still possible. His interference in tactical decisions made bad situations worse. But the fundamental reality was that Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win against enemies with overwhelming industrial and manpower advantages. Falaise was a symptom of that larger reality. For France, Falaise was both liberation and devastation. The battle freed French territory from German occupation, but it also destroyed towns, killed civilians, and left a landscape of wreckage. The French forces of the interior had fought alongside the Allies during the battle, harassing German retreats and providing intelligence. Regular French army units had participated in closing the southern jaw of the pocket. France was reclaiming its sovereignty but at enormous cost. The Polish contribution to Falaise deserves special mention. The Polish 1st Armored Division fought with extraordinary courage and effectiveness. They held critical positions against overwhelming German forces. They closed escape routes and refused to be dislodged despite heavy casualties. For the Poles, who had no homeland to return to, who were fighting for an uncertain future, the battle had special meaning. They were proving that Poland still existed as a fighting force even though it had been erased from the map. The coordination between different national forces at Falaise was imperfect but ultimately successful. Language barriers created communication problems. Different tactical doctrines caused confusion. National pride sometimes interfered with cooperation. But the mission got done. The pocket was closed. The enemy was destroyed. And every nation involved could take pride in the victory. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years, Falaise stands as one of the decisive battles of World War II. Not the biggest, not the longest, but decisive in its effects. The German army in France was destroyed. The path to Germany was opened. The end of the war became inevitable. And at the center of that victory was a general who'd been mocked, doubted, and underestimated. Harry Krar's vindication at Falaise should have made him famous. It should have secured his place in popular history alongside Patton, Montgomery, and the other celebrated commanders. But fame requires more than accomplishment. It requires personality, charisma, the ability to capture public imagination. Krar had none of those things. He had competence, professionalism, and dedication. In the end, he won the battle but lost the propaganda war. Today, outside of Canada and military history circles, few people know Harry Krar's name. Patton has been the subject of movies and countless books. Montgomery is still debated in British military circles. Eisenhower became president and a global figure. But Krar is forgotten, except by those who study the details of the Normandy campaign. Perhaps that's fitting. Krar never sought fame. He didn't write his story because he was too busy living his values, quiet service, professional competence, putting the mission above personal glory. In an age that worships celebrity and personal brand, there's something almost subversive about a man who did great things and then disappeared into quiet retirement. But for one critical period in August 1944, Harry Krar commanded more troops than any Canadian before or since. He closed the Falaise Pocket. He destroyed the German army in France. He proved every critic wrong. Not with speeches or dramatic gestures but with results. And in the end, results are what matter in war. The mockery before Falaise and the silence after it tell us something important about how we judge leaders. We celebrate the loud and the bold, but wars are won by those who deliver when it matters most. Harry Krar faced the ultimate test with 560,000 lives in his hands, the weight of history on his shoulders, and every critic waiting for him to fail. He responded not with speeches or bravado, but with methodical brilliance that destroyed an entire German army. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, the cautious Canadian had achieved what the flashy generals only dreamed of: total, decisive victory. Eisenhower walked the killing fields in silence. Patton had no jokes left to tell. And Bradley's gamble had paid off in ways that changed the course of history. Sometimes the greatest generals aren't the ones who seek glory. They're the ones who win when winning matters most, who understand that war isn't theater but mathematics written in blood. Harry Krar proved that at Falaise. The world forgot his name, but the soldiers who fought under him never forgot what he did when everything was on the line.